All right, now we know by definition that the sine of theta is y over r, cosine x over r. Just review. Tangent is y over x. And of course, we know what those reciprocal trig functions are. If we think back, just review briefly about reference angle. Say our angle was here, and it goes through some point, xy. If this is our angle, then this is our reference angle. Now, they really have the same trig functions. The angle and the reference angle will have the same trig function values, except whether or not the big angle has positive trig function values or negative trig function values. That's what we're going to have to look at here. The sine of this angle is still going to be y over r. The sine of this angle is y over r. The difference is the reference angle is acute, so it's always going to be positive, but the big angle could be negative or positive depending on where the terminal side of the angle lies. So for instance, if we think about the cosine of 4 pi over 3, what's our reference angle going to be? Well, let me ask this. What quadrant does 4 pi over 3 lie in?
3.
Quadrant 3.
Is it pi over 3?
The reference angle, we find the reference angle by subtracting pi. So that gives us pi over 3. So the trig function value for 4 pi over 3 and pi over 3 are the same, except that for 4 pi over 3 it could be negative or positive. Now thinking about the cosine of 4 pi over 3, a third quadrant angle, is the cosine negative or positive? It's negative. And what is the cosine of pi over 3?
The square root pi over 3 is positive.
The cosine of pi over 3 is?
It's the square root of this positive thing over 1 half.
It's 1/2.
So it's negative.
But 4 pi over 3 is going to be negative 1/2. Okay, on 9 pi over 4, we said our reference angle was pi over 4. So I've got to figure out where is 9 pi over 4.
Quadrant 4?
Quadrant 4? Do we think quadrant 4 is right? Well, what happens if I divide 9 by 4? What do we get if I divide 9 by 4?
Just over 1 half.
We get 2 and 1/4. Okay, so 2 pi, that's 2 pi plus 1/4 pi. So what quadrant are we in?
1.
We're in quadrant 1, so if I wanted the sine of 9 pi over 4, it's just the square root of 2 over 2. But say I had asked for 7 pi over 4. What quadrant does that lie in?
4?
That lies in the fourth quadrant. Is the sign negative or positive?
Negative.
Negative. So once we know the reference angle, all we have to do is figure out where does that terminal ray lie. We looked at 7 pi over 6. I want to find the cosine of 7 pi over 6. Okay. Reference angle is
1/6.
pi over 6. All right, so we know all about pi over 6. Cosine of pi over 6 is square root of 3 over 2. Now we just got to determine, is it negative or positive in quadrant 4?
Positive.
Positive. Okay, so the cosine of 7 pi over 6 is positive.
How did you find the reference angle for 9 pi over 4?
7 pi?
Okay, hang on, James asked me a question. How did I find the reference angle for 9 pi over 4? Okay, I told you the easiest thing to remember. If, what's negative?
The cosine, you said
In
it
quadrant
was,
4.
It's
Quadrant
quadrant
4
3.
is positive.
you said the cosine is 7 pi over 6. 7 pi over 6.
Is it
Oh,
quadrant
I was thinking 9 pi over,
Oh,
no,
okay.
what was I thinking? 7 pi over 6, it is negative because it's not quadrant 4, it's quadrant 3, thank you. Okay, 9 pi over 4. Is that reduced to lowest terms? Is there any common factors between the numerator and denominator? No. That means pi over 4 is your reference angle. Whatever's in the denominator. Remember when we had on our homework 11 pi over 12? Does numerator and denominator have any common factors? Pi over 12 is your reference angle. That makes it easier when you have fractional radian measure. Suzanne? Yes, ma'am. Okay, yes, cosine of 7 pi over 6, I'm sorry, I was thinking, I had in my head 3 in the denominator, but that was not right. Yes, ma'am.
So your cosine and sine and everything for like your normal theta angle is going to be the same other than like whether it's negative or positive
Yes.
as the reference angle?
Yes. Let's think about 4 pi over 3. Did we do that one? Cosine of 4 pi over 3? Yeah, I think we did that one. Sine of 5 pi over 3. Okay, they're saying negative square root of 3 over 2. So what's the reference angle, Clarissa? What's the reference angle? Is this reduced to lowest terms?
Yes.
So what's the reference angle? Pi over 3. What quadrant is this in? 5 pi over 3. That's almost 2 pi, right?
Yeah.
Because 6 pi over 3 would be 2 pi. So what quadrant does this put us in? It's in the fourth quadrant. All right, is the sign negative or positive in the fourth quadrant?
Negative.
It's negative, and the sign of pi over 3 is square root of 3 over 2.
How did you get what quadrant it was in?
Let's look at these. The tangent of a negative 210 degrees. Negative. I didn't say it. I said it, but I didn't write it. Okay. Negative 210 degrees. How could I find a positive angle that's going to be coterminal with negative 210? Add 360. So if we do that, we get the tangent of 150 degrees. Now you may remember from the unit circle what the tangent of 150 degrees, but it's more likely you remember what the reference angle is. So what is the reference angle for 150 degrees? The reference angle is 180 degrees minus 150 degrees, or 30 degrees. So the tangent of 30 degrees is square root of 3 over 3, and is it going to be negative or positive for this one? Quadrant 2, so negative. Cosine of a negative 60 degrees. What quadrant is that going to be in? Quadrant 4. What's the reference angle?
300 degrees. Sorry, no. You add 360, right?
It's just 60 degrees. Your reference angle is 60 degrees.
Oh, I thought we were trying to get it to a positive.
You could, but this one that's already an acute negative angle. So we can just, that one you don't even really have to do that. You could, but it's an acute negative angle. So what is the cosine of 60, of negative 60 degrees?
That would be 1/2.
1/2. It's positive because it's quadrant 4, yes.
And your theta is,
Let's let theta be in quadrant 2. And the sine of theta is 1/3. I want to find the cosine and the tangent using identities.
Oh, yay.
What?
Using identities. We need to know our identities. Okay, so we know the sine is 1/3. We're in quadrant 2. What does that tell us about the sine of the cosine and tangent? Are they negative or positive?
Well, negative.
They're both going to be negative, aren't they? So if you want to,
Wait, are we supposed to do that thing when we're like sine squared? Okay.
okay, I'm just wanted us to, we don't want to forget, we've got to consider what quadrant we're in, so our final answers are going to be negative. Okay, so what identity to find the cosine, Kat?
Oh, I thought you were just doing like the sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, but you replace like 1/3 with sine, so it's like 1/3 squared plus cosine squared equals 1.
Good. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1 is that first Pythagorean identity that we've already learned. And so the sine squared is going to be 1/9 plus cosine squared. So the cosine squared is,
Has to equal 8 square root of 8/9.
the cosine squared is 8/9. So the cosine
Square root of 8 over 3.
is equal to really plus or minus the square root of 8 over 3. But we've already determined we have to use the negative value.
Should we like simplify?
Yes. Okay, so now how do we find the tangent? What trig identity are we going to use for the tangent? Well, tangent is sine of theta over cosine of theta. So the tangent is going to be a negative 1 over 2 square roots of 2. But we can't leave it like that. So we get a negative square root of 2 over 2 times 2. All right, let's let the sine of theta be negative 5/13. And then we are in quadrant 3. I want to find the secant and the tangent using identities. The secant and the tangent using identities.
The secant is negative and the tangent is positive.
We use apply.
Okay, that's right. The secant's going to be negative and the tangent's going to be positive because we're in quadrant 3. How can I go about finding the secant?
do the third one, the third identity.
Do I have what I need to use the third identity?
Probably not.
So do you want to find?
Secant's reciprocal of what?
We find the cosine.
Find the cosine. And so sine squared plus cosine squared. And yes, I know that you could find that without the identity, but the instructions were to use identities. So we have 25 over 169 plus cosine squared equals 1. So cosine squared equals 144 over 169. And the cosine is usually plus or minus 12 over 13, but we are in quadrant 3, so we want the negative value. So the cosine is negative 12/13. So the secant is negative 13 over 12. And the tangent,
5 volts.
tangent of theta is sine over cosine. So it's 5 over
Oh.
12, yes.
No?
Yeah, that was a rel.
No.
Oh, it was, I'm so sorry. Michael, pray.
Okay, you're still recording.
Well, thank you so much.
Right. If I told you that the sine of theta is 1/2, we're not going to use our calculators. There are two angles that have a sine of 1/2. Can we figure out what those are without our calculators? Okay, I heard 30 degrees.
Oh, 30 and 60.
Okay, 30 degrees, and then pi over 6 if we want to do radians. What's the other one? 150 degrees, or 5 pi over 6. Okay, so without a calculator implies without your unit circle.
Oh, forget the
Oh, okay. 30 times 5 is.
Okay, if I ask you to give me two angles whose sine is negative 1/2 without your calculator or unit circle, what would they be?
That would be.
210 degrees.
Wait.
Yeah, 210.
What is that in radian measure?
And,
Michael,
oh,
you're not
it's
supposed to
7
look at that, Michael.
No.
Okay, and then the other one? Get
Michael,
here.
Michael.
No unit circles.
He had to stop that. Okay.
Or,
It's almost 210,
Wait,
so all is gonna be
negative.
over there, so it's gonna be
Or,
330 degrees.
330 degrees.
That one is going to
330, that would be, is it?
That would be
11
pi over
11 pi over
11 pi.
6. Oh, no.
Okay, so how did you figure out what they were? What did you determine?
Find the factor between 330 and 130.
I was just
And
thinking
within
about.
30 and 75 by 30, it's at 1.
Okay, so what's the reference angle?
Oh,
5 or 6.
Pi over 6. If you think about what the reference angle is, it's pi over 6, or 30 degrees, which tells you if it's positive, it's first quadrant or second quadrant. Once you know what the reference angle is, then it's real easy. Subtract from pi, or subtract from 180 degrees. If the values are negative, you know you're a third quadrant or fourth quadrant, so you add pi over 6 to 180, or subtract it from 2 pi. So you're going to have a few problems where it asks you to not use your calculator or use your phone to find values. And these are values that you're going to know from, it'll be pi over 6, pi over 4, or pi over 3. Those are your quadrantal angles. Those are the only ones that you should know. The quadrantal angles and those three basic reference angles, pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3. From those, you can find any of those other angles that are on the unit circle.
Are we gonna use the unit circle?
Next week, and then,
Freak out, you're using chemistry?